Hello, welcome back to Kim Reads as we continue with Straight On Till Morning. The Qqrimal. It was all predator, sleek and slinky and black and light. Its paws had claws, long furrowed half moons that easily ripped through the fairy's dress and closed around the waist. Without thinking, Wendy threw herself at it, grasping at the beast in her own hands, naked, pink, and clawless. One would suppose that after her experience in Neverland, she might stop and think twice about engaging a strange creature, an unknown entity who might have had any number of unpredictable and magical attacks. But the thing's closest approximation to any London beast was a cat. An angry, starving alley cat. Fierce but not indomitable. Wendy had had her fair share of experience with those, ranging from pulling them off hapless songbirds to begging her parents to let her keep one. And in fact, the twin mirrors on the front of its snub face could have been mistaken for cat's eyes with the light shining on them. Down, Wendy cried imperiously. Her hands closed tightly around its middle, but it didn't yowl as expected. It dropped the fairy in shock, then sort of thinned out between Wendy's fingers. The creature slid through them like oil, dripped to the ground, and formed into a weaselly, mink-like critter. Wendy looked at her hands, but they were clean, like she actually felt was soft, for one would expect. With barely a pause, the creature found Tinkerbell and again leapt on her. The little fairy was a bit stunned and shaken up by the first attack. She was on the ground and stumbling. She emitted exactly half a jingle wail before the body slammed on her, smashing her straight down to the ground. I said get off, Wendy cried. She grabbed the first stick she saw, and those usually opposed to violence toward animals whacked the criminal as hard on its side. It rolled off its way, but it kept its claws around Tinkerbell, the fairy close to its belly. Then it jumped on its forepaws and laughed. You, Wendy stamped, indignant. It really was. The horrible thing was laughing at her, chuckling and warbling. It bent its head and licked Tinkerbell with an ugly gray forked tongue. It smacked his mouth. Wendy brought the stick down as hard as she could on its head. It easily leapt out of her reach, landing on the side of a tree. With this new purse, it chuffed one more time back at Wendy before scuttling up like a lizard into its branches. No! Wendy dropped her stick and grabbed the trunk of the tree. Come back here this instant. She shook the tree as hard as she could, expecting disappointment, but the tree was a slender tropical thing whose body was more lithe and liable than its London counterparts. It swayed easily under her efforts. Its long leafy fronds clattered and clashed satisfyingly. The creature fell and hit the ground with an equally satisfying whomp. Tink, Wendy grabbed the teacher's tail to yank out the fairy. Only its tail slid into nothing into her hands. Overpowered by the momentum she had created with nothing to balance it, Wendy fell back on her bum. The creature looked back to her and chuffed again. Faint jiggling sounds could be heard pitifully from under its stomach. The Qqrimal wagged its tail at Wendy and took off into the forest. Tinkerbell dangled from its mouth. The poor fairy jingled desperately as it disappeared in the bushes. No! Wendy got up after it as fast as she could. Flying was out of the question. She wasn't an expert, and the understory of the jungle was far too dense for her to even consider it. And she already had a late start. The smaller, more lithe carnivore easily left over obstacles and slunked under them. Wendy also had fallen trees and ducked under canopies of vines, trying to keep the thing in her sights, but she was much slower. The Qqrimal was black as shadow, and made almost no noise as it fluffed on the floor, just a pitter-patter and occasional chuck. She burst out into a hot, angry clearing, an empty hilltop whose dry pinnacle could support little life. The sun beat down like a physical force. It was no longer a happy lemon. It was a blazing ball of fire. Wendy spun around, looked for signs of the criminal. But the ground was dried and cracked. that had no recorded fingerprints. The edges around the side of the clearing were staffed by half-dead yellow trees that all looked the same. There was no hint of the creature. Tink? Wendy cried. Tink? No, she murmured, turning and turning. No, she cried again, and her voice fell flat and quiet in the thick, fetid air. Tinkerbell, she screamed, but the jungle was silent. And that's the end of that chapter. See you later.